This is a little bit of a weird one, and that's kind of what I want to kind of talk about here. But there was this report on Fox News that the Supreme Court adopts modified ethics code after pressure from Hill Dems. Now, obviously, please understand this is a Fox report, so it is obviously going to be a little bit biased one way in particular. But what they're saying is the Supreme Court is meant to be supreme, right? It's meant to be above everything. Like, it's not meant to be impacted by everything. Only the House or the Senate is only allowed to, one of them, is only allowed to appoint one. The rest of it is kind of up to the Supreme Court of how many they have and the rules they're governed by and all those sorts of things. They're meant to be above things, but now there's this pressure now for them to be ruled by this code of ethics, and now kind of as a way for the government to now influence something that's not meant to be influenced. The Supreme Court is meant to be uninfluenceable. I don't know if that's a right word or whatever, but what Dr. Roddy, you're running your church, right? What happens when someone who's not meant to have influence or impact over you tries to have impact over you?
Well, I'd like to say just ignore it. That's not so easy to do sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't really had that experience, but occasionally you will, because a church service is actually a public event.
Mm-hmm.
And generally speaking, anybody who wants to attend a church service can do so. And obviously we encourage that because you want people to enter into a saving relationship with the Lord Jesus Christ. But look, I think that we find, say, in the church, that we're increasingly being governed by political parties who are passing legislation which impinges upon the freedom of expression of religious belief, and that's happening all over the world. And we're obviously going to talk about that in relation to China.
Yep.
And I think it's not a good thing. I mean, clearly there are some expressions of religious freedom that are inimical to a civil society, like killing people, as an example. That clearly is not an appropriate expression of our religious belief. But there are many, many other areas in which governments are proscribing what churches can do. I think we do have to stand against it as best we can. And it's not easy to do. It's not at all easy to do. And there are a couple of states in Australia where it is in fact becoming much more difficult even to teach the truth of the Word of God in church on a Sunday. There are two states in particular where it is now becoming quite dangerous to stand up for what most people would have actually believed to be true even 30 years ago.
Yeah. So let's talk about the Supreme Court and this situation that's happening now. How they're meant to be independent, they're meant to be above all, and they're meant to govern things and be the last say on things like that. How does like I said, I think it's the Senate that's trying to influence this.
Yes.
How do they have, seemingly they're not meant to have power, but how do they have power?
Look, I don't understand the American system. In fact, the more I see of it, the less I understand it. And it is seriously broken at the moment. Look, this all started, of course, when the High Court made decisions that some Democrats, maybe even most Democrats in government, didn't like.
Yeah.
And there are a couple in particular. One, of course, was overturning the Roe versus Wade decision. There were some who didn't like that. I mean, it seems to me, if you look at their decisions, and I haven't read them all very carefully, but I have glanced at some of them, they have I think it could be argued that they've interpreted the Constitution as it was intended by those who framed it originally. And I actually think that's the right way to deal with constitutional issues, although, of course, not all jurists actually agree with that particular position. Certainly postmodernists don't agree with that position. But I do think it's very dangerous to meddle with the separation of powers, that is, separation of the power of government and the power of the judiciary. Now, it has got conflated in America, where there is now a very clear political cleavage, and we see that, of course, in the indictments of Donald Trump and the way in which the so-called rioters of January 6th are being treated in relation to some of the pro-Palestinian marches in recent times. So, look, the American system is just so broken at the moment. A couple of comments I would make, however. I have actually read the code of conduct that the High Court issued. It runs to 13 pages. There's about 8 pages in the code itself, and there's a page which is basically the signatures, and then there's another 4, I think, pages of explanations. It's a very reasonable statement. It really clarifies issues surrounding what might disqualify a judge from acting on a particular case, and it makes it fairly clear that things like accepting a holiday paid for by a friend are probably something which shouldn't be done. Also, using staff to promote things like a book you've just written, that's something that also shouldn't be done. And look, they're fairly reasonable. And look, it pretty much accords, I think, with codes of conduct I've seen in relation to, say, members of the parliaments, and certainly in the United States at lower levels in the judiciary. It's fairly unexceptional. And I think for that reason, it may not actually satisfy the Democratic senators who want to make a change. Look, despite what they say, I think they're motivated purely by political considerations.
Yeah.
And I think it's to the detriment of the American legal system, and certainly to the detriment of the separation of powers. And I mean, there is no doubt that there is this tug of war between the so-called conservative judges and the progressive judges, and they have different philosophical views on how the Constitution should be interpreted. And the essential division is between those who believe that you should make decisions of constitutional impact based on what those who originally wrote it intended.
Yeah.
In other words, you put it into the context of the time in which it was written. But the progressives are really saying you should make interpretations of constitutional matters based on the general sort of social milieu that exists currently.
Did you say manure?
No, I said milieu, not manure, but there's
But
plenty
it is pretty much manure, isn't it, at the moment?
Yeah. So look, I honestly don't know. I've actually read through that code of conduct. To me, it's very reasonable.
Yeah.
And look, essentially, as they say, it encodes what has been practiced anyway. Really, the only 2 areas which are very different are those which would cover payment of holidays and other favours by people who are just your friends, that really got nothing to do with whether or not you're qualified to take a particular case. And the other one would be where you're using your own staff or staff of the High Court to promote a book. Now, there's nothing wrong with writing a book at all. Nothing wrong with that at all. There's nothing wrong with earning royalties from writing a book.
Yeah.
but what they're saying is you shouldn't use High Court staff to promote it. Look,
Yeah.
I think it's a very reasonable document, but because of that, I'm just not sure they're going to satisfy the agitators in the on the Democrat side of the Senate, and they've got the majority, of course, in the Senate.
So if you are a judge and okay, they're bringing in this code of ethics, and sure, we all need ethics to guide us in what's right and what's not right, because we as humans do tend to push the boundaries and take advantage of situations when we can. So it's good to have a code of ethics, which is great. But what do you do as a judge when you're working hard to bring justice to things and make decisions on things and everything like that, and you're getting this external pressure that's starting to try to push towards, let's just say, one side of the aisle, so to speak? How do you respond to that?
Look, I think they're in a really difficult position. It's very hard for them to fight back because they need to do all they can to preserve that division of powers. I think it's very hard because they'll be seen to be making political statements, and their own code of conduct now says they really can't do that.
Yeah.
I think they're in a really difficult position, and I think it really is quite reprehensible that these Democratic senators are trying to propose and ultimately, I guess, pass legislation that will actually, I think, interfere with the division of powers.
Yeah. So,
look, honestly, the judges they've got a really tough time ahead of them. I think it's quite significant that nine of the High Court judges signed up to this document. Their signatures are all on the document. Good on them for doing that. So those who would be seen as being both on the left and the right have signed up, and I think good on them. As I said, I've read the document. It's very reasonable and encode what has been their practice, generally speaking.
Yeah, and I think that's good. And I'm going to go back to one statement that you made kind of at the start of this segment. I think it was at the start of this segment, is you just got to ignore some things. And so while, yes, there are some tough challenges and there's external pressures and everything like that, we all in life have external pressures or external influences that come in that sometimes they've signed the code of ethics. As long as you're doing the right thing and stay within the letter of the law and make sure you're squeaky clean, so to speak, or whatever, make sure you're doing the right thing, and then just ignore everyone else. Just because people will constantly, people will try to influence you and will try to change things and will try to, but you just got to stay your course. Sometimes you just need to make sure you stay your course and do the right thing and ignore the haters.
I think that's probably true. There are some situations in which you really cannot, as it were, defend yourself. Yeah. And it's not just judges that are put in that position. Often directors are as well. Mm-hmm. And so if you happen to be on a board, you might find that there are some circumstances under which you'd just love to defend yourself, but you cannot do that.
Yeah. And one thing that I've been working on lately, some of the challenges that I've been facing, is just ignoring those external influences that are trying to influence, because they're affecting me. So I'm just trying to just do my thing, not respond. Because sometimes when you respond, you're just giving them fuel to be able to respond back. Or if you defend yourself, sometimes it just makes you look more guilty. And so sometimes it is best just to ignore it and just keep your head down and just keep moving forward. Just make sure you're doing the right thing yourself. And I suppose one mantra that I have been saying to myself lately is, well, it's between me and God. As we go back to David and Saul, let God judge between us who has been righteous, or who's done the right thing. So yeah, look, stick to your code of ethics. Try to ignore the haters. Hey, you've just watched an excerpt from the On the Cube Leadership podcast. If you've liked that, give it a thumbs up. If you've got any thoughts of how it challenged or helped your leadership, put a comment below. And we'd be honored if you would consider subscribing for more leadership content. Also, make sure you check out the playlist for more episodes like this.